Hey, Lord, how's it going today? Glowplasma 201 here, back in day, talk about Kagurabachi, chapter number 45. This chapter is titled, What Comes Next? And if that is, not a chapter title that I think you could use literally anywhere in any type of shonen series, oh no, what comes next? Are we gonna have, the, Jujutsu Kaisen or World Trigger situation? I know I say Jujutsu Kaisen because it is a way better example in this than World Triggers, because nobody knows what World Trigger is, and it's very sad because World Trigger is peak fiction. But Jujutsu Kaisen, of course, it has all of its arcs sort of as a chapter title, and it just adds on to those. Of course, hey, the Shibuya incident, chapter number 45 or whatever. Or in Kagurabachi, is it just going to become a theme that after the end of arc wrap up chapter, that 1 or 2 exposition chapter there before we get on into the next one, it's going to be oh, what comes next? Because that's really how any shonen series works. It's all right, that arc's done. Well, I wonder what we're doing next time, and yada, 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 you. And this chapter is just titled What Comes Next. A little bit funny, a little bit interesting. But yeah, this is a very interesting chapter of Kagurabachi because, like I said, it is the sort of midpoint between the next arc, which will most likely be about the Kamunagi and, of course, Chihiro joining them, and, of course, last time what happened, which was the whole end of the Rakuzachi auction house arc, where, of course, all of the stuff with the Shinichi happened. Of course, that's where, Hakuri came into the picture, and also where Hiyuki and what is the other sumo wrestler dude's name? What is it, Tafuku, I think? Let me just check the wiki real fast. Yeah, Tafuku. I thought I had that, but I didn't quite know. So yeah, last chapter was really just about all of the wrap up to that arc. The whole idea is oh, now the curtain closes on the Rakuzachi, is now pretty much most people are dead, so don't really need to worry about that anymore. And this chapter starts off in a very interesting way, because of course last chapter ended with Chihiro going up to Hiyuki and just saying hey, or this in sort of flashback whenever Hiyuki ended up taking the Shinichi enchanted blade with her to the Kamunagi. Chihiro's just hey, you won't intend under your jurisdiction too, so how about this? You guys do that and let me personally go and join the Kamunagi. And that's pretty much how that worked in the last chapter. But we don't actually sort of start off in adjacent to anything there. I mean, we start off with, of course, an adjacent idea, but we don't directly start off with, okay, here's Chihiro at the Kamunagi headquarters, right? We actually start off with the Hishaku Leader, who we met during the last arc. Of course, he has that weird symbol on his hand that, probably is the Hishaku symbol, but we don't know what it sort of stands for or anything yet. As we pretty much just get some narration from him, just going hey, it's all going smoothly, just as we predicted. The Kamunagi will now take possession of the Shinichi. Right, they really have no other option. There's nothing they can do. They're playing right into our hands. Yes, it is time for our next move. And we sort of get a little bit of a disturbing panel with the leader sort of just sitting here, and he's sort of just sitting there, and he's got his chin resting on his hand where the symbol is, and it's just a very sort of creepy image, just going all right, what are these guys actually planning? Why do they need the Kamunagi to have the Shinichi? I'm guessing that it's either has something to do with, of course, there's probably a traitor in the midst of the Kamunagi, because of course, how did anybody else get Rokuhira's location after the war, and how did they kill him, who leaked it to Hishaku, all of that stuff. So it is a little interesting of why are they letting Chihiro, or not, what was I going to say? Why is this playing right into the Hishaku's plans? And I'm not going to pretend like I'm qualified enough to sit down here and say, oh, well, here's why, because I really don't really know. But after this first page, we cut over to where Chihiro and all of the other rest of the gang are, as we see that Chihiro suddenly wakes up from laying on a bed, right? And we sort of just see his face startles awake, and we see that Chihiro sort of starts to get up and look around, and the first person he sees is none other than Mr. Shiba. And Shiba sort of turns around and is oh, look at that, perfectly in sync. As we see that, of course, Hakuri, who is in the bed next to him, is also now up now, which is really funny. So I guess the implication is that the two of them woke up at the same exact time because they are perfectly in sync, which it's just a really funny gag to do here. So we pretty much see that Haruki's like, oh my gosh, where are we? And we see that he's just like very groggy. And Shiba's like, all right, hey, good morning, you two. And he's like, so how are you guys feeling, right? And we pretty much see that last chapter, whenever Chihiro and Hakuri were talking to each other, sitting on the ground, looking in front of all of the rubble of the old auction house, where the Rakuzachi auction happened, we see that Chihiro's just like, all right, so what comes next? And pretty much Shiba just explains that after Hakuri said that the two of them literally just passed out from exhaustion, just sitting down right there. And there's a little panel of the two of them just sort of in the same exact position, which is like Z's coming off of their head, like dead asleep, right? And Shiba's just like, and you guys did it at the same time. Like, are you guys like twins or something? Which, oh my gosh, it's such a good thing. Hakuri and Chihiro like together. It's so incredibly nice. But Shiba pretty much just says like, hey, it's 11 in the morning, the day after Rakuzachi auction, and today it is November 9th, right? And Chihiro sort of is like, all right, so what are you guys doing? And as he sort of fully sits up from the bed, he looks in front of him to see a scene being played out here. So we see there are two beds next to each other. There's, of course, the one where Chihiro's in, and then the one to the side of it, or the one, let me see, what it would be to the left, I think. It's to the right on our perspective, but it'd be left if like Chihiro is sitting up out of bed. We see that Hakuri's on the other bed, and directly in front of Chihiro's bed, we see that there's a massive television screen where we see that 4 characters are sitting there in front of it. Of course, we see Mr. Shiba there, who's got a game controller in his hand. We see Hiyuki, who is also sitting here with a game controller in her hand. And we also see Tafuku, who has Char sitting in his lap, also sitting there looking at the television. And they're sort of, the two of them are sort of like pointing it out, just like making fun of like, oh, look at that. Go Hiyuki, you're beating Shiba's ass. Like, go look at that, haha. And it's such a nice little panel to have here in Kagurabachi, because it's just all of them hanging out. Like, it's just awesome. It's such a great panel, right? But eventually, after we sort of see this panel, we see that Hiyuki looks back over to Chihiro and is like, hey, you took forever waking up, right? And Tafuku's just like, hey, but don't worry, though, we weren't necessarily bored. We had things to go on and do, right? And we get a little, like, a back and forth between all of them. And Hiyuki's just like, yeah, this video game freak kept us entertained over here. And who's his face? Tafuku's like, yeah, it was literally all night. Like, we couldn't escape from it, right? And she was like, yeah, I creamed their asses. And Hiyuki's like, who even are you anyway? Why are you here? I only want to do stuff with Chihiro over here, right? And Chihiro sort of makes a mental note of, okay, they obviously don't know that Mr. Shiba was ex-Kamunagi, because Hiyuki would know, being that she's one of the strongest people. She's a wielder of Flame Bone, for instance. Granted, we don't really know. Oops, I hit the mic. Hopefully that doesn't like make a sound or anything. But yeah, Hiyuki doesn't know who Shiba is. A little bit of an interesting thing, right? Chihiro then asks like, hey, but what about all of the prisoners that were at the Rakuzachi? Shiba's like, hey, they all went home, and Char's just sort of suddenly speaks up, just like, hey, I have a message for you from Inazuma, who was, of course, you, and Char pretty much says, like, he said thank you. We see that Hakuri didn't really know who that was, and he's like, Inazuma, and Chihiro's just like, yeah, Mr. Inazuma, that's what that kid at the Rakuzachi called himself, and he's like, thanks for letting me know that, Char, I'm glad to hear that. But it's sort of all of this happens, Hakuri just says like, oh man, Mr. Inazuma, that's a pretty cool name. But pretty much before he can finish that thought, Hiyuki cuts him off, because of course, what else is Hiyuki gonna do but cut somebody off? And she just says like, hey, anyway, everybody's okay after all of that stuff. And she's like, normally, it'd be the Kabunagi's job to keep the peace and protect all of these vulnerable people, but the fact is, the evil still runs very much rampant in Japan. It's because the Kabunagi doesn't have the necessary manpower and grit to deal with it. And she's like, so either way, yesterday, thanks to you guys, we pulled off the entire situation seamlessly. And we sort of just get a look at Hakuri's eyes during this, as he sort of just looks on and just sort of reflects on everything that happened here in this previous day. But Shiba eventually speaks up, just saying like, hey, But guys, those were some insane shenanigans, as he starts to think of all of the moments, especially in that last arc, where Chihiro was just going headstrong. Like, Shiba's like, hey, this is pointless, let's withdraw. And then Chihiro's like, no, and like, maybe we should regroup and regroup for now. And like, no, stop, you're already at your limit. Like, every last person here has to be saved. And Shiba's like for real, I'm just so glad you guys are okay after all of that, because that could have been very catastrophic. It could have been bad. Thank you guys for being alive still. Like, it means a whole lot. We need these youngsters going to the future generation, right? And we pretty much see that both Chihiro and Hakuri just have like a, hey, we're sorry. But as this happens, Chihiro sort of suddenly makes like a logical question, like, hey, where's Inten? Of course, his sword. And Hiyuki's just like, hey, I entrusted the Shinichi with some colleagues, and they're at Kabanagi headquarters. She's like, so I'll take you there now, so get ready. And as she says this, she sort of pulls up the Inten from beneath her and sets it on top of Chihiro's bed. So he's got his sword with him, right? Shiba then just says like, hey, Chihiro, I heard about your deal. You said that you'd give them the Shinichi and that you would end up joining the Kabunagi. And he's just like, hey, so it's your priority to reseal the Shinichi. And I mean, that makes perfect sense. But he's like, are you really sure about this? And he says like, Hiyuki told me that you met one of those Hishaku guys, right? And Chihiro sort of just has this look as he thinks on the face of the leader of the Hishaku, who of course he met last arc. And he just gives like a, yeah, I did meet him. And Shiba's like, hey, I get why you're so anxious about all of this, but that's exactly why we need to make our next moves extremely carefully. For the past 3 years, the Hishaku have been making meticulous preparations that we can't even fathom the extent of. If their goal was for the Kabunagi to take possession of the Shinichi, that means they already have their next move planned. There are other ways we could have prepared this, right? And he's like, without joining the Kabunagi. And Hiyuki sort of just cuts him off, just in like, hey, hold up, what kind of garbage is that? And she's like, other ways, it's already been decided, and he's coming with me to the Kabunagi, no ifs, ands, nor buts, like, it doesn't matter. He's coming with me. That's sort of all there is to it. And this, she sort of finishes that up. Tafuku just is like, hey, plus you seem to take it for granted that the Kabunagi will end up sealing the Shinichi again, but that is actually for the higher-ups to decide, and there are alternatives to sealing it, like using it, which we saw the power that Kyouro was able to get out of it, and that was with the sheath barely coming off of the sword. Like, what truly frightening power does it have? Because, of course, we know that Shinichi is the strongest enchanted blade, and we saw that for good reason. So, of course, Chihiro wants to get it sealed so it can be sort of either back in his possession or safe with the Kabunagi, because he doesn't want his father's sword killing more people, and that's sort of how also Hiyuki and a bunch of these other characters that we know also feel about the situation. But Tafuku brings up a really good point here of, you guys aren't a Kabunagi. They get to decide in the end, right? And Shiba, after hearing this, sort of thinks and is like, hey, I get it, that's not our problem. If the idea is to end up sealing the Shinichi, we have to hand it over to the Kabunagi. There are way too many concerns with this, and that's why we should talk it out and eliminate as many as possible. But as Shiba's thinking this, Chihiro speaks up, just saying like, hey, but what would be the Kabunagi's motivation for using the Shinichi? And Tafuku is just like, hey, with the Shinichi's power, we could break the Kabunagi's deadlock with the Hishaku, as we remember to what the very short Kabunagi leader, because I'll go and sort of spoil this now. By the end of this chapter, we are going to get sort of like a few panels on the face-ups of all of the various Hishaku, not Hishaku members, the various Kabunagi leaders. And the one we've seen before is the guy who sort of has like a little bit of a goatee, he wears some small glasses, and he was very short earlier, and he's got sort of white hair that sort of sticks back up, and he's got a little black streak in the top fit. Really, we don't get any of their names. We just know that he's a little short guy. And where was I in the chapter? We remember when he talked to, I think, Hiyuki in one of the previous chapters, or whoever he talked to, I don't quite remember. We just remember him saying, like, hey, the Kabunabi have the Sword Masters and the Thieves have the Enchanted Blades, right? So it's that constant balance, like, because you really can't use one to its full power without the other, because, of course, we saw whenever Sojo got a hand of it, and, of course, there was no Sword Master for Cloud Gouger, how that ended up happening, right? So yada yada yada, it makes some good sense here, right? But Chihiro pretty much just speaks up and is like, hey, if I can show you another way to break the deadlock, then there's no reason for the Kabanaki to use the Shinuchi, right? And Chihiro's like, hey, Mr. Shiba, you are completely right. Maybe I am rushing things, but this isn't just a stab in the dark. Now I've got Hakuri, as he sort of motions over to his side, and Hakari's like, what? Why are you pointing to me? And Shiba is like, okay. And Hiyuki's like, okay, well, you've got to explain the strategy. You just can't tell us that, right? And Chihiro's like, hey, we just need to steal the Enchanted Blades back from the Hishaku. And we pretty much see that almost everybody in the room is a little shocked, like, wait, what are you talking about? But Chihiro explains, just saying, like, hey, Hakuri can freely transport registered items and items affiliated with them. For example, if he registers me, he can transport the Inten from one location to another. They just have to be connected by spirit energy, and an internal contract meets that standard. In other words, if Hakuri makes contact with the Sword Bears in Kabanagi custody, then he can transport the Enchanted Blades. And this makes perfect sense, because of course we saw how did Chihiro get into the storehouse to fight with Kiora last arc. Of course, Hakuri pretty much registered him with the Inten and transported him to the Inten. So it makes sense if he makes contact with the Sword Bears, he can warp the swords back to him. If not, vice versa, he could warp the Sword Bear to the sword, which would also be maybe a more interesting way to do it. Is like, okay, here we are, we've got whatever like I said, we really don't know what any of the swords are called yet, so it's a little interesting. I mean, we know what 3 of them are, but the other 4, we have absolutely no idea. So it's like, hey, here's the Enchanted Blade. What's a good name? Let's see. They haven't done, I guess they sort of did like the weather one. They sort of did like a grass one. What if they did like a space Enchanted Blade, like the Space Slasher? I don't know. It seems like a very bad name, but it's like, all right, I have the Space Splasher here, and I'm going to transport the sword wielder to it, and that's how they ended up winning a fight. That could also be a very interesting way to portray this here, right? But Chihiro, like I said, he just explains that whole idea, and we pretty much see Haruki's like, the Sword Bears, and he's like, I mean, that makes sense, but he's like, are you really talking about, like, those Sword Bears? The people who Kunishige Rokuhira chose to entrust with the Enchanted Blades? As we get an image of the other 4 Sword Masters or Sword Bears, I think they've been called 2 completely different things in these chapters, so I don't know what the official term for them is. But pretty much to go over these character designs here, we see that there is a guy who is obviously blind because he has 2 stars running down his eyes. He's wearing sunglasses, which is just like a cool flex, and he obviously has a cigarette in his mouth. We see a female character who seems to have some like a circular patterned ribbon in her hair, and we really can't tell too much other than that. There seems to be another guy with some long streaks of black hair that are just running over his face, and he seems to like have one of those sun hats that the Japanese wear on, where it's sort of like, not like a cowboy hat, but it's like one sort of like those curved rice hats like you see like Ronin and like really Ronin wearing in popular Japanese media, or at least American versions of that Japanese media. And we pretty much see that he has got some hand signs going on. And then we see another guy who sort of has, he is also blind in his, what is that? That is his left eye? No, it's his right eye, if I'm not mistaken. And we see that he's got a nasty scar going down the side of his face. We see he's got a mustache. Can't really tell if he's got a beard. But to me, he sort of looks like a blacksmith type character, because he also has that, like, traditional, like, blacksmith, like, round, circular, braided hairband going around his head. So who really knows? They're actually like the same hairbands that we've seen, Kunishige, Rokuhira, and all of them. Like if you go back to that first Kagurabachi color page, in the first chapter, you can sort of see both Chihiro and his father wearing them. So I think it'd be very interesting if maybe this character is somehow related to them, and like maybe he was an old friend of Kunishige, so Kunishige entrusted him with one of the swords. And like, who is this blind guy with sunglasses smoking a cigarette? He seems badass. Who is this lady? What is she up to here? Like, pretty interesting. And who is this guy who, as I saw somebody on the internet say, who's this guy throwing up gang signs, right? Like, we don't really know anything about any of these characters yet, besides for their very surface level, like, zoomed in face looks, right? But after we sort of get this, and Haruki's just like, oh, the people, Kushige, Roku, choose, wield swords or whatever, Chihiro speaks up and looks over to Tafuku and is like, hey, how can we get in touch with them, right? And Tafuku's just like, hey, with the exception of the Sword Master, the Bears of Enchanted Blades are hiding out in Kamunagi-controlled locations throughout Japan. If they die, then the Enchanted Blades in Hishaku's hands become usable. They're so heavily guarded that most of the Kabunagi's forces are invested in actually protecting them. Only the top brass have the ability to be authorized to see them. He just continues on giving some more like lore, just saying like, hey, they're located in fortresses known as Sanso. As we see 4 locations here, we see the Senku-Suji Temple, the Kokugoku Hot Spring, Kuin Tashiya Shrine, and Sushi Shibaru. And we see these 4 locations, and presumably these are these Sanso where these other 4 sword bears are located. Now, of course, we know that the 4th sword bear, of course, the Shinuchi guy, who looks really rugged and doesn't look like he's very happy to be alive. We know that he's like entrusted in like those stone pillar things around him, but we actually don't know where that is. But presumably the idea here is like, all right, the blind guy is at the Senku-Suji Temple, just going in the order of how these things are introduced and how the entrance of these art characters looked, but we don't really have any confirmation yet. It really could be any one of them, and I don't think just looking at them there is a very good way to necessarily tell. But yeah, we see there's one temple, there's a hot spring, there's a shrine, there's a Sushi Shibaru, or Subaru, I don't know what that necessarily is. I know what a temple is, I know what a shrine is, I don't know what that is, so it sort of is what it is. Maybe I should have researched before I started filming, but I don't really care. But sort of as Tafuku sort of explains all of this, Hiyuki's just like, or no, Hakari's like, oh man, pretty cool, but Hiyuki's just like, hey, it just sounds cool. And she's like, hey, to ensure absolute security, most of our people are stationed at these Sanso, right? Isn't that what they were called? Yeah, Sanso. She's like, most of the Kamunagi forces are stationed at Sanso. That's the reason we're so short-handed. The bulk of our forces are actually incredibly tied up. And she's like, and that's why we have to really pick our battles. Like, only reason we were at the Rakuzachi is because they were doing an enchanted blade. That's why we can't, like, go toe-to-toe with the, Hishaku. It really does make a lot of sense, right? But, Hakari's just like, hey, but if we get all the enchanted blades back, then the Kabunagi will be freed up. And all of those people we set free yesterday can live in a much safer world, right? And Hiyuki's like, yeah, I mean, the world would definitely be significantly safer, right? And Hakari and Hiyuki just keep getting me constantly tripped up, right? But Hakari's just like, hey, that cinches it, like, let's go see these sword bears, right? And Chihiro's just like, thank you, Hakari, I am going to need your help again, right? And he's like, I got it, Chihiro, we're going to do this. And apparently we hear that the 2 of them are actually yelling, because Shiba makes a little note of like, guys, come on, stop yelling, we don't need to be loud here, right? But that's really all we get from that scene, as we suddenly cut outside to a car driving down the Japanese freeway, I guess, or down the city streets, I don't know. The car is just driving through, right? And we see that in this car, Hiyuki is talking, just saying like, hey, sealing back the enchanted blades from the Hishaku is an excellent proposal. Nothing really beats that, but it won't be easy. First, you'll be judged on the basis of your character and trustworthiness. You can't prove who you are other than a guy who's been wielding an enchanted blade and his good old pal. As far as the higher-ups are concerned, there's no telling what you'll do if they let you meet the sword bearers. There's no guarantee to let you on board. In fact, you could possibly end up punished. And she just says, prove yourselves. As we suddenly cut into a room, into presumably the Kamunabi high brass sort of meeting room, as we see that Chihiro is standing here. He's got his hands in wooden blocks behind him. I forget what this is called, but it's sort of that shackle-based thing that you often see used in like medieval times, where their hands are encased in a piece of wood that has 2 holes cut in it and sort of is able to slap shut. And we see that Chihiro has his hands here as we see images of the 9 leaders of the Kamunabi. I'm not necessarily going to be going through all of these characters because there really isn't too much to talk about with them. Of course, you'll probably learn much more about these characters next time whenever they actually start to interview Chihiro, but that's really what it is. There's a guy with a long neck, there's a short guy I talked about earlier, there's a woman, there's a guy with an eye patch, there's a guy with a weird mask on, there's a guy with really weird sideburns, there's Azami. Azami's here, and he has a very concerned look on his face, I have to say. Then we see a guy with long earlobes, and then we see the guy who's presumably the leader of the Kamunabi, and he's pretty much sitting there at the head of the room and just says, state your name. And of course, our main character just says, Chihiro Rokuhira. And that's really all there is to it there as we end off the chapter. And yeah, this is a very, very good chapter. I'm sorry, guys, heard anything in the background there. Like I said, I'm recording this in a college dorm room. Probably not the best place to be doing it. But we see that Chihiro's here, and I literally just lost my entire train of thought. Yes, next time, Chihiro will presumably be interviewed by all of these members of the Kamunabi. We will learn more about them. But really, this chapter was a means to sort of push the plot forward, and I really love the panel, of course, I think everybody loves, sort of like the found family panel of, oh look, here's Hakuri, Chihiro, Shiba, Char, Hiyuki, and Tafuku, right? Only if Hinao was there would sort of all of our allies of Chihiro be in the same room at the same time. But very good chapter. We really get introduced to a lot of characters, to the 4 other, well, we don't get introduced to them, we get first looks at the 4 other characters of the sword bearers, and then all of these 9 sword master, the Kamunabi people. I'm sorry, it is very late, I've had a long day, my brain is absolutely fried as I'm recording this, but we also got to look at the locations where these sword bearers are, which will probably be pivotal locations in the future, whether there's going to be fights there, or if they're just going to, or if our team's going to go there to transfer the swords out. So a lot of good things coming up for Kagurabachi, and of course, next time, Chihiro will most likely be going through the Kamunabi Can We Trust You exam. And yeah, thank you guys so very much for watching this Kagurabachi chapter review. I really don't have anything else to say on the chapter. So if you enjoyed this is the second one of these I have done, so let me know if you're enjoying these, because I plan to continue them even if you say you don't enjoy them, so but I would like to know if people are enjoying them, because that's sort of a point. I want to make content that people do actually enjoy. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm very tired, I've lost my train of thought. If you like this content, there's going to be a playlist down in the description where I've got other manga review series like Oshinoko and World Trigger. Go check out those guys. If you want to connect more with me, there's links down in the description to Twitter, Discord, and all of these other places where we can talk about Kagurabachi or whatever else anime and manga stuff you want to talk about. And yeah, I really don't have too much else to say. Thank you guys very much for watching this Kagurabachi chapter number 45 review. This chapter is titled What Comes Next. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time for Kagurabachi chapter number 46. Yeah, I'll see you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.